because Kenya is the place where Queen Elizabeth II ascended to the throne. This is where she became the queen. Now, let's look at Kenya as a case study for colonialism and see where we fit in the picture. Mark Curtis, 2003, in an article entitled Web of Deceit, Britain's Real Foreign Policy, Britain's Real Role in the World, from pages 324, said according to British authorities, 80,000 Africans in Kenya were interned. But the British records were grossly misrepresented. It was closer to 500,000. Because Caroline Elkins estimated that between 160,000 and 320,000 Africans were interned in detention camps, also known as concentration camps. Other estimates were as high as 450,000 interned. Most of them, more than 1 million Kikuyu, were held in enclosed villages as part of the villagization program. You see, they were afraid of Africans who believed in their own human and civil rights. And the British went on a brutal, violent, inhumane campaign of mercilessness to hunt down any Africans who believed that African people must own their own African land. Anyone who had an opinion that these lands should not be just given over to the Europeans for their dream and vision to be established was considered to be a major threat. Thousands of Africans were beaten or sexually assaulted to extract information about the Mau Mau threat. Later, prisoners suffered even worse mistreatment in an attempt to force them to renounce their allegiance to the insurgency and to obey commands. Prisoners were questioned with the help of slicing off of ears, boring holes in eardrums, flogging until death, pouring paraffin over suspects who were then set alight, and burning eardrums with lit cigarettes. The use of castration and denying access to medical aid to the detained by the British were also widespread and common. I want you to understand something about this torture, which the British actually agreed to pay some compensation to Kenya around 2013. But these atrocities that I'm speaking about were not against the Mau Mau soldiers. These atrocities that the British perpetrated in Kenya, where the Queen of England became the Queen of England, and they were under her, this is Her Majesty's army doing this. Those atrocities, as I said, were not done against the Mau Mau soldiers. They were done against African civilians who were suspected of knowing them, where they live, how they can find them, if they're friends or family members of them. And those brutal crimes against humanity were committed against anyone who was suspected of even being as an associate of the Mau Mau soldiers. Look, according to an article entitled Kenya, UK expresses regret over abuse as Mau Mau is promised a payout. This was in the UK Guardian newspaper out of London, June the 5th, 2013. It said, this one is heavy. Among the detainees from the Mau Mau who suffered severe mistreatment was one individual, Hussein Onyango Obama. According to his widow, British soldiers forced pins into his fingernails and buttocks and squeezed his testicles between metal rods, and 2 others were castrated. But this individual who was tortured by the British was the grandfather of future President of the United States, President Barrack Obama. And little did they know, when those British soldiers were committing those atrocities, that one of the men that they were torturing would one day have a grandson who would be the President of the United States of America. The historian Robert Edgerton describes the methods used during this emergency period. He said, if a question was not answered to the British, to the interrogator's satisfaction, the subject was beaten and kicked. If that did not lead to the desired confession, and it rarely did, more force was applied. Electric shock was widely used, and so was fire. Women were choked and held under water, gun barrels, beer bottles, and even knives were thrusted into their vaginas. These are the crimes against humanity that were under the auspices of the British royal monarch when Queen Elizabeth II ascended to the throne in this same country. According to Edgerton, in Mau Mau, an African Crucible, a London 1990 publication from pages 144 to 159, he explains that men also had beer bottles thrusted up their rectums. They were dragged behind Land Rovers, whipped, burnt, and bayoneted. Some police officers did not bother with more time-consuming forms of torture. They simply shot any suspect who refused to answer their questions, then told the next suspect to dig his own grave. And when the grave was finished, the man was asked if he would now be willing to talk. On several occasions, I have shown you images of the punishments, the brutality during slavery in the 1800s go back. But this is in the 1900s, past the midway mark, under the Queen of England. Listen to this. In June 1957, in Kenya, Eric Griffith Jones, who is the Attorney General of the British administration in Kenya, wrote a letter to the governor under the British administration in Kenya, Sir Evelyn Baring, detailing the way that the regime of abuse at the colonies' detention camps has become severely worse. He said, quote, that the mistreatment of the African detainees is distressingly reminiscent of conditions in Nazi Germany or communist Russia. Now think about this, people. This is the British Attorney General in Kenya who is writing a letter to the governor of Kenya, and it is the governor who is the representative of the Queen. And the Attorney General is telling the governor, listen, these atrocities that we are committing against these Africans are way too brutal. And he was highlighting it not so much because he cared about the Africans, because they were concerned about the publicity that might get out, that might make the crown and the queen and the monarch and the royal family look bad. But look, despite this, he said, that in order for abuse to remain legal, Mau Mau suspects must be beaten mainly on their upper body. Vulnerable parts of the body, the Attorney General wrote to the governor representing the Queen in Kenya, vulnerable parts of the body should not be struck, particularly the spleen, liver, or kidneys. And it was important that those who administer violence should remain collected, balanced, and dispassionate. He also reminded the governor that, quote, if we are going to sin, we must sin quietly.